and welcome to Bexley Public Library. Thanks for tuning in to our Gerrymandering and Redistricting Ohio program. My name is Sue, and I'm an Adult Services librarian. And now a few words about our guest speakers. Catherine Turcer is the Executive Director of Common Cause Ohio, a grassroots organization devoted to open and accountable government. As a public interest lobbyist, Catherine promotes access to the ballot and open government at the Ohio Statehouse. She coordinates the Fair Districts Equals Fair Elections Coalition, which work together to successfully pass state legislative and congressional redistricting reform. Mia Lewis is Associate Director of Common Cause Ohio. She joined Common Cause during the push to pass 2018's anti-gerrymandering issue 1, coordinating teams across Ohio to push for a yes vote. Mia comes from an organizing and educational background and is passionate about protecting and expanding the right to vote. So I'm going to pass it on to Catherine and Mia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So Mia's going to pull up the slides, but while she does that, I just wanted to welcome everybody. This is a really good day to be talking about redistricting and thinking about how it is we're going to tackle gerrymandering this year. I always love May 4th, Star Wars Day, and so I'm going to just say May the 4th be with you. And so here today, we're going to talk about, what are the problems with gerrymandering? We're going to talk a little bit about what exactly redistricting is, and we're going to go through a process. So Mia, move on to the next slide. I always think it's helpful to know who we are. So Mia and I work for Common Cause Ohio. Now, Common Cause came out of Watergate. Essentially, it was the notion that every organization and company has a lobbyist, but there isn't a lobby for the people that's really focused on government and the rules of government and how they keep people in and out. And I started working on redistricting reform in the late 90s. So I have been at it for a very long time, but our partners, the League of Women Voters, have been at it even longer. And so they started on their first redistricting campaign, their first attack on that mighty gerrymander in the 1980s. And so, as we think about how we've transitioned over time, 10 years ago, we were the Ohio Campaign for Accountable Redistricting. Now, it was pretty darn clear that that name wasn't going to work. And so we've been focusing on, just being really clear. What is it we need? We need fair districts so we can have fair elections. And we have a very broad coalition, and we want to invite you all to be part of our Fair Districts team. And many of you, I noticed, as I looked to see who was hanging out here today, you are in fact part of our team. And so thank you so much. And then Mia, if you will move to the next slide. I did want to highlight in the chat, you're going to find information and links. So Tiffany Rumbalski, who's also from Common Cause Ohio, is throwing in information in there. She's also going to be taking the questions that you put in the chat and putting them into a document so that we can answer all of your questions. And so I wanted to really highlight that it was a really long road to get to new rules when it comes to map making. And that for many of us, we worked many, many years to come up with new rules and to actually embed those rules in the Ohio Constitution. Many of us collected signatures, and we spent time at the State House lobbying our state legislature. And after many, many years, in 2014, we got the legislature to put state legislative redistricting reform on the ballot. And so in November of 2015, Ohio voters overwhelmingly supported the reforms. And we thought, okay, well, we did state legislative redistricting reform. Of course, the next step is congressional. But that took some effort to get our state legislature to pay attention. We started doing a citizens initiative in 2017. By the time we collected 100,000 registered voters' signatures, we actually put enough pressure that the state legislature said, okay, we're actually going to do something with this. And of course, as you know, this took a little bit of time, and we started to think, oh, they're not actually going to take up congressional redistricting reform. And it really wasn't until we finally got to 200,000 signatures that the state legislature passed congressional redistricting reform, with voters overwhelmingly approving it. So it was more than 75% of the vote for congressional, 72% for state legislative. And I think it's really important. We're used to reform measures passing, but this one passed in all 88 counties. And so we should take that as a sign of just really broad approval, that people really don't want to have manipulated districts that manipulate our votes. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my friend Mia.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to mute everyone so that when folks come in that they're muted. And if you need to talk afterwards, you can unmute yourself. Very good. So today we are just going to go really quickly through some basics so that we have time for a conversation afterwards. So we're going to tell you, what is redistricting? Why do we do it? Why is it important to have fair districts? What are the new rules and the timelines that we have in place because of those reforms that Catherine mentioned that passed in 2015 and 2018? And then how can you get involved and help to make sure that there are fair districts in Ohio? So the first thing we're going to talk about is actually apportionment. And we just got apportionment data last week, extremely exciting. We found out for sure that Ohio is moving from 16 congressional districts to 15. So for some strange reason, it's not in the Constitution. There are 435 congressional districts in the United States. And every 10 years after the census, that is mandated in the Constitution, we have a census every 10 years to count every single person in the country. Every 10 years, we redistribute those 435 congressional representatives so that there's roughly equal representation all across the country. And sometimes those, it comes right down to just a few people. So Minnesota and New York were separated this time by 89 people. 89 people separated New York and Minnesota, and one of them lost out on a congressman. So that's apportionment, that's doling out those 435 representatives, but also associated with the census every 10 years is redistricting. And we do redistricting for congressional districts. We do it for Ohio Senate districts. We do it for Ohio House districts. We do it for school districts. We do it for city councils. We do it for many different bodies. And the idea behind redistricting is simply that you end up with roughly equal representation, equal population in districts so that there's equal representation. We don't have to change the number of senators or the number of representatives in Ohio, but we have to change the shapes of the districts that they represent, not only because we have new rules, which we do in Ohio, but in order to make sure that those districts are roughly equal in population. So let's just give a little example of that here. So let's say you have, this is a school district with 20 people in it, and there are 5 in each district, and these are where the district lines are. But over the period of 10 years, people move. They move for jobs, they move to be closer to their family, people are born, people die, there's more economic opportunity in one state than another, there's shifts. And so the census recounts everybody, and it also says exactly where they're living so that we can redraw the lines to make sure that we have equal representation in each district. So this is what we're now going to do. When you draw the lines, every 10 years, you're going to redraw those lines. When you draw the lines, it's an opportunity to take power, to get power. So the people who are actually drawing the lines have a lot of power, and they want to keep that power. So let's take a theoretical example here of a population that consists of dogs and cats. And the dogs and cats, there's fewer cats than dogs. There's 20 cats and there's 30 dogs. So you could have a group come in and draw districts here in a way that was absolutely fair. 10 cats in these 2 districts, 10 dogs in each of these districts. You've got 2 cat districts, 3 dog districts. It's perfect representation and it's fair. But they're a little bit strangely shaped, those districts, and I'm not sure who would draw them that way. But I mean, I think it would be an independent person was drawing, nobody representing dogs or cats would probably draw them that way. That was an independent commission probably drawing those lines there. But if we move over to the next example, here we have dogs drawing the lines. And what the dogs have done, you actually can't see my note that I have on the bottom here, which is that the dogs have done a thing which in, when we talk about gerrymandering, we talk about cracking. So what the dogs have done here is they've taken a little bit of cat population and they've cracked the whole cat population and put a little bit in each district. And by doing that, they actually end up winning all 5 districts and the cats have 0 representation. Clearly that's not fair. But believe it or not, if you allow cats to draw the lines, be in charge of drawing the lines, they can do a thing which is called packing. You can see here, what they've done is they've taken as many dogs as they can and crammed them into 2 districts, essentially to forfeit those districts. So go ahead, dogs, you take those 2 districts. And then they've put a little bit of dogs in each of the other districts so that the cats, even though they're a clear minority, have ended up with the majority of districts. So they have a lot of power and they're using that power to make sure that they have an advantage. And drawing those lines like that means that they're going to keep that power for 10 years. And that's essentially the situation we've been in this country since the very beginning. So this is a picture of the original gerrymander, which was done by a fellow called Elbridge Gerry way back at the beginning of our country. And he figured out that he could get an advantage by packing and cracking and moving voters around and drawing these funny shaped lines. And, you know, it looks funny, but it's actually not funny. It's really bad, and it's really bad for our democracy. And it's getting worse and worse because of course, we have powerful computers now that can draw those lines and compare districts, you know, down to the level of each voter. What are the problems with gerrymandering? Okay, so the first problem is that gerrymandering creates safe districts and predictable election outcomes. Once you've drawn those lines that way, you can be pretty much guaranteed you know who's going to win and lose. In Ohio, for example, in 10 years, the races in Congress have stayed the same. There haven't been any flips. They were drawn to have a certain balance, and that's how they've stayed. When you have predictable outcomes in races, then that makes elected officials unresponsive. If they know they're going to win, why do they care what you think? So, you know, and that's a disincentive for voters to actually get out there and vote. Why should you bother to vote if you know who's going to win and you know they're not going to pay any attention to you? So what happens is the important race becomes the race at the primary. Who will get to represent the Democratic Party or represent the Republican Party? That's the race that becomes important. And you're not playing to all of the electorate, you're playing to just one party. And so that encourages candidates to become more extreme. And so you end up with the people winning the primary are the more extreme candidates. And then when they become elected, they're not able to negotiate. They're not able to find common ground. They're not able to really, you know, have functional government. Extreme candidates who cannot compromise lead to dysfunctional government, and dysfunctional government serves no one. It doesn't serve the people who voted for the majority party. It doesn't serve the people who voted for the minority party. Let's just give you an example. In Ohio, you know, upwards of 80–90% of people over time, increasing numbers of people in Ohio believe that there should be background checks for gun sales. It's a common sense thing. Doesn't matter if you're Republican or you're Democratic, Ohio voters believe that. But what has the Ohio legislature done? Not only have we not put in any gun safety legislation, we've actually passed Stand Your Ground. So it's really important to realize that gerrymandering has an effect. Any issue that you care about, whether it's gun safety or reproductive rights or environmental issues, it's very, very hard to have functional government when you have gerrymandered districts. Oh, sorry. The other thing is it does is it locks in unfair representation because, for example, in Ohio, even though we're a little bit more red than blue, but we're not far off 45, 55, something like that. And yet the balance in Congress is 25-75, and that's been true for 10 years. And similarly in the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate, the representatives the elected representatives don't actually reflect the desires of the voters. So there's a lot of votes that are essentially being thrown away because of very, very successful gerrymandering. So the party that holds the power to draw the districts will draw the districts so that they win, and they will continue to win. How does that look in Ohio? Well, here she is. Here's what we've had from elections first in 2012 and up until this year. So you can see there's some very strange shapes here, very contorted map. It's much, much harder to draw a gerrymandered map than it is to draw a fair map. And let's look at, you guys here in Franklin County. So here's District 3. And just gonna move this so I can see it a little better. District 3 is a picture perfect example of packing. So you have the majority party, the Republican Party, was drawing the lines, and they know there's a lot of Democrats in Franklin County. So they have an incentive to draw a district that grabs as many Democrats as possible and shoves them all into one area. And so you end up with what we call the ink blot here, an ink splatter, because they have to run around chasing the Democrats and packing them all in and throwing away those extra votes. It's not like the Democrats won by 51%. No, they won by 80, 90% or something. So it wastes Democratic votes to make sure that there aren't extras, in order to make competitive races elsewhere. So you end up with, Ohio State University is here, but these areas where a lot of the students live are in a different congressional district. You have somebody over here who is surrounded by District 3, but is living in District 12 or 15. So it doesn't really make much sense. And then you have perfect examples of cracking. You have, for example, in District 12 here, you've taken an area inside Franklin County with a lot of Democrats, and you've cracked it and put it into an area with a lot of very, very deep red rural votes, which are going to be more Republican. This little wedge here that you see, that's Clintonville, basically, that little thing that if you look at this, the arrow, and you see the little wedge, that wedge has more Democrats in it than the entire rest of District 12. But by taking it and diluting it and putting it into that whole other area, then you can guarantee that District 12 will always vote Republican. That's what gerrymandering is all about. Same in District 15. So you end up with someone who lives in Upper Arlington in the same congressional district as someone who lives in Athens, which really doesn't make much sense at all. So that's our map as it is now. Where are we now? Sometimes people say, well, we had redistricting reform. Why aren't the maps better? Well, that's because we're drawing the maps this year. Census was last year. Map drawing is this year. New elections with the new districts will be next year. And, we know that the folks who have the most power drawing the maps will try to draw them to their own advantage. Absolutely, that's what they will do. So The rules that are in place are not perfect, and yes, people can take advantage of them, but we're still glad that we have new rules. There are some states that have no rules at all, and people can do anything. But we do have rules here in Ohio. Thank you to those who were out collecting signatures and everyone who voted for the reform measures in 2015 and 2018. So, you know, we have to be vigilant and we have to watch, but we have rules, and Catherine is going to tell us about our new system for drawing both Ohio legislative districts and US congressional districts. Oh.
Perhaps the most important thing is I go off mute. There you go. About that. So I think the thing that is important is that there are rules that affect both the Ohio House and Ohio Senate and congressional maps. And so pretty simply, there's a focus on keeping the districts compact, and they focus primarily on keeping communities together. You know, one of the goals of representation is, you know, that we can hold our elected officials accountable and that they are also accountable to our community. So there's a real focus on keeping the community together. And to do that, their focus is on keeping counties, cities, and townships whole. The notion of like, it's a proxy for community. You know, yes, it's not perfect. I, for example, live in Dublin, which is in 3 different counties. So it's not perfect, but it's a way of saying, you know, how is it that we can create rules that will mitigate the worst aspects of gerrymandering and manipulation? Well, the way to do that is to keep political subdivisions together. The other thing, and you know, when we looked at the reforms in 2011, many of you will remember that the district lines were drawn in a hotel room. And public records revealed that they called the hotel room the bunker. We know that Team Boehner, this is John Boehner, that he weighed in on the district lines, and you know that in fact it was the consultants and Team Boehner that were approving so many of the changes. We know that district lines were changed to address requests from donors. So the Timken plant was added to then Jim Renacy's district. And so we really focused on, as we were promoting our reforms, we focused on keeping communities together and making sure that the process, as much as possible, could be transparent. And so, Mia, if you're willing to move to the next one. So there are rules that are a little different for the state legislature. So if you go back to the slide that had the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate, there are 33 Senate districts to 99 House districts. And so to do the districts, you basically have to nest, meaning every Ohio Senate district is made up of 3 Ohio House districts. And there's a rule that says you cannot draw a district to favor or disfavor a political party. You know, basically don't gerrymander. And so when they say plan in the Ohio Constitution, what they mean is don't draw maps that way. Then the other thing that is different and has not been done in other places, and this was the brainchild of a guy named Dick Gunther, who's a professor emeritus at Ohio State, was the notion of representational fairness. That one of the reasons that Ohioans have been working on addressing gerrymandering so long is we've been a swing state. We've been a bellwether state. We know that we're not exactly a 50-50 state, but we definitely are not a 75% Republican. Or as you think about it, you know, 12 of the congressional members are Republican and 4 of them are Democrat. We just know that that's just not right. And so representational fairness looks at how we as Ohioans vote across the state and says, okay, well, let's say we're 55% vote Republican and, you know, and then you have 45% the vote Democrat. Well, that's the way those districts should look. So, and it's a way to encourage that anti-gerrymandering rules. It's just a way to make sure that there's good fairness. And I'm really looking forward to seeing this be put in place this year during the map making. Mia, if you're willing to move. Okay, so this is the other thing. All right, so one of the challenges, it's not just transparency, it's not just rules, it's the notion of like, well, the map makers so far have been of one political party. What can we do so that we can ensure that there's better representation? And in this case, for years we worked on pushing and promoting an independent commission, but the state legislature in 2014 said, you know what we're going to do when it comes to the state legislative maps? We want to create a more bipartisan redistricting commission. So this is based on the former Apportionment Board. And the focus here is to say, okay, we're going to have 3 members of the executive branch. So it's governor, auditor, secretary of state. And then we're going to have appointees by both the D and the R's, the Democrats and Republicans in the Ohio House, Democrats and Republicans in the Ohio Senate. Now, if you look at this, all of a sudden you're like, well, okay, so you've got Governor DeWine, he's a Republican, Keith Faber's a Republican, Frank LaRose is a Republican, Bob Cupp's a Republican, and Matt Hoffman is a Republican. Now, the way that the reforms work is that you should look at the buy-in this way. There's 7 members and 4 members need to approve the maps. And 2 of them have to be Democrats or have to be of the party that's out of power. And so in other words, even though it's not even Steven with Democrats and Republicans, it becomes essential to get those Democratic votes. And Mia, if you will go to the next one. So I always say to people, our rules for map making this year are the consequences of Democrats and Republicans having some arm wrestling at the State House. So a lot of times we'll talk about the sausage making and you don't necessarily see it in legislation. But I do think when it comes to the rules, there were things that we really focused and really promoted. And so that was transparency. It was making sure that there was bipartisan map making, making sure that there were good rules that keep the communities together. Anything that would make it so that it was clear that the map makers couldn't manipulate the districts. But we need to realize that the reforms really focus on getting at the worst excesses of gerrymandering. So it reins in the worst impulses, and it does it by partisan map making and limits on splits. So that means splits of communities. So when Mia was talking about population, one person, one vote, that when it comes to these districts, they should be fairly close in population. And yet there shouldn't be so many splits that you end up with the snake on the lake or Marcy Kaptur's district, that 9th Congressional District, or that silly duck district that we looked at, or for that matter, those districts that we looked at that surround Franklin County. So the 12th Congressional District and the 15th Congressional District. And so Mia, if you'll go to the next slide. So for Congressional, there's a real focus on keeping counties whole. Now this becomes important compared to the state legislative ones because the districts are larger. So as opposed to thinking about 99 Ohio House districts, we're going to be talking about 15 congressional districts this time. So there's a real focus on keeping those counties whole. Now there's some simple rules that focus on, hey, let's keep 65 of the 88 absolutely have to be kept wholly in one county. The next thing that is important about this is that anytime there is a county that has enough population to sustain a congressional district, there is a requirement to have that to be a district that is wholly in that county. And so we need to have 65 that are contained within a district. And then there are places like Franklin County where we have enough population to have a congressional district. Now we have a congressional district right now that's completely, in Franklin County. That's Joyce Beatty's 3rd congressional district. And we know that you can gerrymander that way, but then surrounding it, you couldn't do all of the different tiny pieces. And then this is Cuyahoga County, where you can actually see that there are 4 different congressional districts here. This is the kind of thing that these reforms specifically address, with the notion of keeping communities together and the focus on keeping as much as possible communities together. And I think it's so important for us to consider the role of the public as we go through this. Mia's going to talk a little bit later about ways that we can take action. But one of the things that's very clear is that you can have these rules, but if we don't have good public participation and we don't have, eyes on the process, it can be difficult for them to mind their P's and Q's. So we want to make sure as we're going through this that we urge them to focus on the rules, but not just the rules, the spirits of the reform. And then Mia, if you'll go to the next slide. Okay, so this slide is pretty simple. It's that whole thing of you can't do this anymore. And I think that that's incredibly important. Yes, as we think about Mercer County, and I noticed that there actually is somebody from Mercer County who's joined us here today. I firmly believe that we had wonderful redistricting reformers from Mercer County simply because it was so clear. Why in the world would rural Mercer County be broken up into 3 congressional districts? It just doesn't make sense. Yes, it doesn't make sense for Cuyahoga County to be in 4 congressional districts, or for that matter, for Franklin County to be in 3, but Mercer County just makes no sense whatsoever. So now, as we look forward to the next things, we need to know that there are rules that are going. Oh, that's fine, Mia. Go ahead. There are rules that are going to keep our communities together, but there are some challenges here. The congressional redistricting reforms are, in fact, as I put it, they really came about because of struggles and debate between both political parties and voting rights experts and voting rights advocates and redistricting reformers were trying to give as much pressure as we could. But we need to realize that there is this, what I think of as a redistricting gauntlet. And one of the things that the map makers, I suspect, are already clear about is that it's very hard to come up with good bipartisan agreement. And when the state legislature was considering the reforms, I said, well, one of the things that we are going to struggle with is we want bipartisan map making, but we also want to have the state legislature be the map makers. We don't want to change that. And so they said, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to see if we can get, a super majority, 60% of both chambers and 50% of both of the major political parties, or the 2 largest political parties. Now, that's actually super hard to do, right? That's incredibly difficult to do. So then if they cannot come to that kind of map making, they hand it off to the Ohio Redistricting Commission. And so remember that there's 7 of them, but they need 2 folks that are Democrats. It needs to be a majority that buys into a map, but they need 2 Democrats, of the 4, that could be 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, but they need a majority and they need 2 Democrats. This can also be difficult. And they said, okay, what if we can't get the Ohio Redistricting Commission to do this? Well, then it goes back to the Ohio General Assembly, so back to the state legislature. And in this case, they still need to pass it by a supermajority, but only with 1/3 of the Democrats. Now, this might be also incredibly difficult, right? This could be really difficult because still, we still need to get 60% of the members, and that can be hard. And it could be that 1/3 of the Democrats don't want anything to do with the map. So they wanted to make a final stage that was both tough in case it ended up with only one political party doing it, and also wasn't attractive. And what makes it unattractive? It's a 4-year map rather than a 10-year map, which can be really hard for candidates who are, thinking about the, how is it? I'll have a 4-year map. I don't know what'll happen to my district. I don't, the Congress people will not like this. The people, as candidates aren't going to like it. Also, it's not really great for voters. When you have a 4-year map, there can be easy voter confusion. So it's really unattractive that way. But if, in fact, there is a simple majority that passes the map and you don't really have, Democratic buy-in or the Democratic Party buy-in. In this case, the rules are tighter. And so basically, what are the rules? So right now, the rules start in the first stage, focusing on keeping those counties whole. When you get to the fourth stage, they have to keep counties whole, cities whole, townships whole, and municipal corporations whole. In other words, their ability to really manipulate those districts, they have almost no choice because it really frames in how they would have to actually make the maps. So the rules get tougher. The other thing that gets tougher is there's a rule that says they can't draw district lines to favor or disfavor their incumbents. This is really important because the political party in power has the most incumbents. Then there's the kicker, which I think is the best part of this whole thing, which is that they have to put all of their choices in writing. Okay, we split this community. They have to explain why they split it. And so, the goal here is to either get a bipartisan map where Democrats, Republicans come together and they say, hey, this is the map for us, or you get a 4-year map, but those rules are so tight that you would, for 4 years, have a really good map. So it's a struggle, and we should see this as a compromise. It's why we need all of us to really be paying good attention so the map makers are so aware that we need to actually have maps that live up to not just the rules, but the spirit of the reforms. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit here for a second. And so we've been talking a lot about gerrymandering. And when we primarily talk about gerrymandering, we're talking about partisan gerrymandering. We go back to Elbridge Gerry, and he drew this district line to advantage his political party. By the the party was called the Democratic Republican Party, which of course doesn't exist anymore, but it kind of makes me crack up. Also, this is a guy who signed the Declaration of Independence. He was vice president under James Madison. And, what we remember about Elbridge Gerry is gerrymandering. So we've been talking about partisan gerrymandering. I do want to be super clear that racial gerrymandering continues to be unconstitutional. So there's Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Many of us are familiar with that. The Shelby v. Holder decision at the U.S. Supreme Court got rid of that. But for Section 2, which has to do with us in Ohio, there's a standard, they call it the Jingles test, for determining whether there needs to be a majority-minority district. And so the rule here is, that you look for a history of discrimination, you look for racially polarized voting, you look to see whether there's socioeconomic discrimination, and you look to see whether, in fact, elected officials in the past especially have not been responsive. And that determines whether it is important to do what they call a majority-minority district. We have one majority-minority district in Ohio, and that is the 11th Congressional District, which Mia is going to show you a picture of in just a second. So this 11th Congressional District, you may be thinking of, oh, this is one of those, This is Marcia Fudge's old district. And of course, Marcia Fudge joined the Biden administration. And at the moment, they are preparing for a special election in August. I didn't even mention that Steve Stivers left, so that gives us another special election. One of the things that I want to highlight about this majority-minority district is that when it was created, it was 50% African-American of voting age population. So not just African-American, but of voting age. And so this district started in, Cuyahoga County and worked its way down into Summit County. And sometimes, when we get used to looking at gerrymandered districts, we think, oh, if it looks ugly, it's not a good district. And sometimes there are districts that look ugly, because this is not pretty, but really are focused on doing a public good. And so, creating a majority-minority district. Now, what you all should also know is that the way that population has changed in this area, there will not be enough population to do a majority minority district, meaning you won't have enough voting age populations that are African American to do a 50% American voting age population district. But they can still create in Cuyahoga County, focusing on the rules that we have, they can create a district that is a good opportunity district for an African American. And so as we think about our, where we live in Franklin County, you have, Joyce Beatty's district, which is an opportunity district for an African American. So it will be very similar. We also should anticipate, if you keep a district wholly in Hamilton County where Cincinnati is, it's also possible that there will be an opportunity district there also for African Americans. And with that, I'm going to take us to this place, which is, all right, so we've been all this year, we've been dealing, with the pandemic and all the changes that we've had to make, and our work lives have been disrupted. And, it's been, I have to say, very stressful. But what we do need to know is that the pandemic also affected the census. And the census is the basis for redistricting, right? You get good numbers and you use those numbers to actually figure out the districts. You need them to be fairly equal in population. Now, we have received the apportionment numbers, but that was last week. Usually we would have received the apportionment numbers in December, and at the end of April, we would receive the numbers necessary from the decennial census to actually do congressional and state legislative maps. So in other words, we are waiting to get really detailed information until the end of August. And even when we get it at the end of August, you all should know it's not going to necessarily be the best, most user-friendly data. That won't come until the end of September. And so we're having to really rethink how it is that we're going to do our timeline. Like, well, if we're supposed to pass congressional districts with the first deadline at the end of September, and the September deadlines for the state legislative map making, that's not going to work. You can't draw districts if you don't actually have the data. And so we really need to start doing some good public hearings and create a plan. Now, there has been some conversation. Senate President Matt Huffman was recommending really quickly, in just a few days, doing a constitutional amendment, meaning an amendment to the Ohio Constitution, to actually change the deadlines. And he wanted to do it, just within basically a week. He started talking about it a week ago. And the deadline is actually tomorrow. It is unlikely that the state legislature will quickly pass an amendment, especially since it goes into the Ohio Constitution, and we'll have to vote, if they do it, we'll have to vote on it in an August special election. And there does not appear to be agreement at all about this, mostly because in the timeline that Matt Huffman laid out, there really isn't adequate time for deliberation. So, what Fair Districts is recommending is that we take a different path, which is we seek what they call relief. In other words, hey, we can't get our homework in because we're missing this other piece. We need this information from the census. We can't actually do the maps. Can we get, a change in our timeline? Can we actually, do our maps a little bit later? We're really recommending that the state legislature and the Ohio Redistricting Commission begin hearings right now to identify how you could come up with a good timeline. Because, it's the kind of thing where you need to have the maps in time for the primary. You need to have the maps in time for the primary. And there are all of these steps in between. So we need to hear from Board of Election officials who are going to have to, make sure that voters are in the correct district. We need to hear from the folks at Ohio University that are taking the census data that we receive and making it so that we can create maps. That is essential because we're going to need partisan indexing, which the census does not provide, because our reforms focus on not drawing district lines to favor or disfavor one political party over another, right? So you need to actually have that partisan information. And it's important to have those hearings as soon as possible. Now, Mia, if you go to the next slide. So this is my very last slide. And I did want to highlight this. While it is true that racial gerrymandering is illegal, you can't draw district lines to hurt minorities of any type, that is unconstitutional and illegal. Unfortunately, in 2019, the US Supreme Court in Russo v. Common Cause determined that gerrymandering is unfair, but in fact, as the Chief Justice, John Roberts, wrote, it's just not something that the federal courts can handle. They said, we clearly identified as unfair, but we really think that the state legislature should actually be dealing with this, and that in fact, federal courts have no role. Now, for many of us, this seems like absolute nonsense. It seems absolutely ridiculous. We all know how hard it is to get the state legislature to put in good rules in place. There's so many different ways that the Supreme Court steps in and makes decisions and plays referee. It seems absolutely ridiculous, but I would like to highlight that as painful as this decision is, we do have good rules that are in place for our map making this year. And the court that we're going to be going to, if there's map isn't any good, and we identify it as being very gerrymandered, or we have challenges, with the map, we can in fact go to the Ohio Supreme Court. And the Ohio Supreme Court is much more balanced than it used to be. And so, when we look at the map making this year, we should look at it as we're in so much better shape than our neighbors like Indiana. Like you start to think about our neighbors that have no rules, and we're in much better shape. And with that, I'm actually going to hand it to my friend Mia.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Catherine. And I'm just going to, for about 1 minute, just going to tell you about some things you can do to get involved, and then we'll try to answer some of your questions. So as Catherine said, we want the map makers to get to work. So we have an action here, and I'm sure Tiffany has been diligently putting links in the chat for you. We have a link that you can click on and send an email to your legislators and to the Ohio map makers to tell them to hold hearings, to tell them to appoint members of the Redistricting Commission, to tell them to look into the possibility of delaying the primary until June instead of May. We have a number of very specific recommendations that we would like the map makers to get to work on. And we have a letter that we wrote to them that enumerates all of those things that you can read also there. So we don't want any hasty constitutional amendments. We want them to get to work. The other thing you can do is send them one of our nifty Ohio, Time for Ohio to Bust Gerrymandering postcards. You can request cards. Actually, in Columbus, you can come and pick them up. We'll send you the address where you can pick them up from. And we have instructions that you can use to write to your representatives and your senators and and to the map makers, and tell them that you want them to get to work and that we demand fair maps. We got to keep the pressure on them all year long. We want them to really feel that, we want them to be feeling that passed in all 88 counties by more than 70%. We want them to be thinking about that all year long, and to know that they really have nowhere to hide if they start trying to gerrymander. And we'd love for you to get involved with fair districts. And again, Tiffany, I'm sure, has put all these links in the chat, but you can sign up to join our email list and stay informed. You can become a speaker in our Speakers Bureau and do a presentation like this, or you can request a presentation. You can write a letter to the editor. You can demand virtual testimony. There are so many ways that you can get involved. And we actually really need everyone's help. And we need you to be talking about this and thinking about it and bringing it up. We also have a community mapping project. We're going to have a map making competition later in the year to see who can draw the best congressional districts. But we also are doing something called community mapping, which is basically people coming together and with the assistance of a facilitator and mapping software, drawing maps of their communities. And there are several reasons to do this, one of which is to have better data available for map makers when they're drawing whole districts. And it's also to prepare people to talk in public hearings and be able to identify why their community is important and why it should be kept together. We know that there will be a whole congressional district in Franklin County, but there's going to be a line drawn somewhere. So where should we draw that line? That line is going to probably bisect some communities, and it's only by speaking up and identifying your community, talking about why it's important, drawing its boundaries, that we'll be able to lift up why it's important to keep those communities together. We have essentially endless ways for you to get involved and endless resources and information. We will share slides with the library. So if any of you are interested in looking at these slides, you'll have an opportunity to do so. And of course, I know you can reach us at our email, fairdistrict.ohio.org. Actually, that's our website, but you can get in touch with us at our email as well. And we welcome your participation in this community effort to make sure that we get fair maps. So that's what I'm going to stop sharing. And then I think Tiffany, Catherine, maybe you're able to see questions.
So yes, so my favorite question so far had to do with this postcard. So one was, so it's a duck, it's a snake, but what's this thing right here?
That's District 12. District 12.
So we have District 4 and District 9 and District 12, and I was calling it a reclining snuffleupagus. Aha. Okay, so here's another question. This comes from Amy. She wants to know about independent voters. So many of us are unaffiliated voters, and these reforms just sound like they're, about Democrats and Republicans. What about independent voters?
Well, you may answer the question yourself, but or I can make an attempt at it. The reforms talk about specifically about requiring the participation of the two major parties, so that independents aren't specifically identified, in the reforms. But of course, in Ohio, most voters, I don't know, Catherine, do you have more to say about that?
So the way that I would answer that is, clearly these are reforms that were generated by the state legislatures. The state legislature, they're Democrats and they're Republicans. So that they focused on how do you basically have a Democrat watch a Republican, and how do you make sure, if there aren't, how is it you can get buy-in from both political parties? And so they were thinking about gerrymandering as a Democratic and a Republican issue. What I would say, as I'm an independent voter, I was raised by a Democrat and a Republican. And so I'm an independent voter. The thing that I would always highlight is that if you have districts that simply are drawn so that the map makers have more of a say than the voters do. So when we think about our congressional districts, 10 years, we had 12 Republicans go to Washington and 4 Democrats. And this is year after year. It didn't matter if it was a year that Obama won or a year that Trump won. Basically, the map was basically the perfect predictor of who was actually going to serve. And so we know that for independent voters, we want to have real elections when it comes to time for November. And so, when you look at primaries, when you have super gerrymandered districts, you end up having the choice really in the primary. You choose the Republican or you choose the Democrat, and the real choice is in the primary. And so for independent voters, that choice in November is really truly taken away. And so you know, yes, I think gerrymandering affects all of us, but it certainly is really problematic for independents who do not participate in those primaries. Anything else you wanted to add, Mia?
No, thank you.
So we have an interesting question here from Maria. She says, has there ever been a serious movement for proportional representation instead of the current system where the winner takes all in each district? And the answer to that is, at one point, we were much more of a proportional representation system. You know, so if you go back in Ohio history, that was one of the ways that we managed our districts. But of course, over the year, we've taken a much more traditional approach, much like I was talking about Democrats and Republicans. It's been, you know, coffee or tea or chocolate or vanilla or, you know, oranges or apples. It seems to me that there are serious reforms that we could consider that could make a tremendous difference in our democracy. And so many of you might be thinking, well, what about ranked choice voting? And there are things that we could be doing with money in politics. There are all sorts of reforms that are big and could make a huge difference. This reform will make a difference. And it's one of the ways that we'll get closer to having a more robust representational democracy. But it is really a first step. I think we need to be really clear. There's so much more that we need to do so that we actually live the vision and you know, what we imagine is a true democracy, for all our voices and our vote to count. There will be more than just redistricting reform that's necessary, and I'm kind of looking forward to those years. But we should be thinking of it as an ongoing quest. Things that you wanted to add, Mia?
No, I'm deferring to you on these
okay
questions.
So now I have a question. So the question has to do with like municipalities and unincorporated areas and how that factors into gerrymandering. So this is what I would say. Ohio is a little bit different, and let's just take Franklin County because I think that's the easiest. We know that the city of Columbus gobbled up certain areas, but smack dab in the middle of Columbus, we have, for example, townships, Liberty Township would be a good example. We have Clinton Township that's smack, you know, like is down near OSU. It also is not contiguous. So there's also a section that's up near Westerville. One of the things that makes the reforms that we focused on a little bit difficult is the fact that some of those townships are not contiguous townships. So when you say, let's keep a township whole, that is easier said than done if they are not contiguous. And so there are some real challenges in creating a reform that focuses on political subdivisions if the political subdivisions actually aren't together. Now, what I would say is that's still less frequent. I mean, yes, we can identify, you know, a couple in Franklin County. There's some challenges. Lake County also has some, and so does Cuyahoga County. But the goal here, especially for Congressional, is to keep those counties together. And we should be looking at the reforms focus on, look at the reforms as mitigating the worst population, but definitely not being perfect. And then any other questions? I'm kind of keeping my eye. I might have hit all of the questions.
I just wanted to say that we are going to send the library a link to a page of resources and our slides, and then the library will send a follow-up email to everyone. So you will have all of the links that have been flowing by. You will get all of those links. They'll be live in the presentation.
Well, I just wanted to thank you all for joining us today to talk about how we can create a more robust democracy. You know, please touch base anytime. We really appreciate how much time people have put into making sure that we get to this point where we have good rules. And now it's a matter of holding those map makers' feet to the fire. And I hope you all are with us on that.
Absolutely. So important. Thank you so much. Thanks for attending.